Picture this scene. The year is 218 CE. A 14-year-old boy sits on the most powerful throne in the known world, draped in silk robes that shimmer with gold thread. His face is painted with cosmetics that would make a Roman matron blush. Around his neck hang pearls that once belonged to empresses. But this is no ordinary emperor. This is Elagabalus, and what he's about to do will make Caligula look like a choir boy. You think you know about corrupt Roman emperors. You've heard the stories of Nero fiddling while Rome burned, of Caligula making his horse a senator. But those tales pale in comparison to what this teenage tyrant unleashed upon the empire. Because Elagabalus didn't just break Roman traditions, he obliterated them with a systematic campaign of depravity that would scandalize even modern audiences. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about Roman decadence. We're talking about an emperor who turned the sacred imperial palace into something that would make a brothel seem respectable. An emperor who committed acts so shocking that Roman historians struggled to find words to describe them. An emperor whose 4-year reign became a cautionary tale, whispered in the corridors of power for centuries. The numbers alone should terrify you. 4 years. That's all it took for this teenage emperor to nearly destroy the foundation of Roman civilization. In less time than it takes to complete high school, Elagabalus managed to bankrupt the treasury, scandalize the Senate, horrify the people, and commit acts that Roman writers called unspeakable. Yet somehow, these same acts were documented in excruciating detail by historians who couldn't look away from the spectacle. But this isn't just a story about one deranged emperor. This is a story about what happens when absolute power falls into the hands of someone with no moral compass, no restraint, and no understanding of consequences. This is a story about how quickly civilization can crumble when its leaders abandon every principle that holds society together. Before we dive into the most disturbing details, hit that like button if you can handle what's coming next. And definitely comment below to let me know where you're watching from. I think it's incredible that people across the world are connected by the same fascination with history's darkest chapters. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came during Elagabalus's coronation ceremony. Traditional Roman emperors were crowned in solemn rituals that emphasized duty, honor, and service to the people. But when this teenage Syrian arrived in Rome, he brought with him a black stone that he claimed contained a god more powerful than Jupiter himself. The stone was called Elagabal, and it would give the young emperor his name. What happened next defied every Roman tradition. Instead of the customary sacrifice to Jupiter, Elagabalus ordered the construction of a massive temple for his Syrian sun god. But this wasn't just religious innovation. This was cultural annihilation. He demanded that all Roman gods bow down to his foreign deity. He forced senators to participate in bizarre rituals that involved dancing naked around the black stone, while Syrian priests chanted in languages no Roman could understand. The Senate watched in horror as their new emperor, barely old enough to shave, declared himself the high priest of a god they'd never heard of. But religious revolution was just the beginning. What Elagabalus did to Roman marriage customs would make your jaw drop. Roman marriage was sacred, built on principles of duty, family honor, and political alliance. Emperors were expected to marry respectable women who would bear legitimate heirs and maintain imperial dignity. Elagabalus took one look at these traditions and decided to demolish them in the most spectacular way possible. His first marriage was to Julia Cornelia Paula, a respectable Roman woman chosen by his advisors. The marriage lasted exactly 1 year, before Elagabalus divorced her, claiming she had a bodily defect. But the defect wasn't physical. The defect was that she was a woman, and Elagabalus had other preferences. His second marriage shocked Rome to its core. He married Julia Aquilia Severa, a Vestal virgin. To understand the magnitude of this scandal, you need to understand what Vestal virgins represented in Roman society. These were priestesses who had taken sacred vows of chastity. They tended the eternal flame that protected Rome itself. Their virginity was considered essential to the city's survival. Breaking their vows was punishable by being buried alive. But Elagabalus didn't just break her vows. He turned her violation into a public spectacle, claiming that their union would produce godlike children who would rule the world. The marriage ceremony was conducted with all the pomp of a state occasion, forcing Roman citizens to witness what they considered the desecration of everything holy. The public reaction was immediate and violent. Riots broke out across the city. Citizens demanded the emperor's removal. The Praetorian Guard began plotting his assassination. But Elagabalus seemed to feed off the chaos he was creating. Instead of backing down, he doubled down on his provocations. He divorced the Vestal Virgin after less than a year, then remarried his first wife, then divorced her again. Roman historians lost count of his marriages, but they carefully documented each one because they represented new depths of imperial madness. Some marriages lasted weeks, others lasted days. One marriage reportedly lasted a single night before Elagabalus decided his new spouse bored him. But marriage was just one battlefield in his war against Roman convention. What he did to the imperial court would make reality television look tame. The Roman imperial palace had always been a place of dignity and protocol. Visitors followed strict etiquette. Audiences with the emperor were formal affairs, conducted according to centuries of tradition. Elagabalus transformed this sacred space into something that Roman writers struggled to describe without violating decency standards. He filled the palace with Syrian dancers, musicians, and what Roman historians diplomatically called entertainers. These weren't court musicians or legitimate performers. These were people whose services would normally be found in the seediest districts of Rome. The emperor elevated them to positions of honor, giving them titles, wealth, and authority over Roman citizens who had served the empire for decades. Dinner parties in the imperial palace became legendary for all the wrong reasons. Traditional Roman banquets emphasized conversation, poetry, and philosophical discussion. Elagabalus turned them into orgies that would have made Dionysus blush. Guests were forced to participate in activities that violated every Roman concept of dignity and self-control. But the most shocking aspect wasn't what happened at these parties. It was who was forced to attend them. Elagabalus required senators, generals, and other high-ranking officials to participate in his debauchery. Refusing an imperial invitation wasn't an option. These respected leaders of Roman society found themselves trapped in situations that destroyed their reputations and compromised their honor. One senator who survived the reign later wrote that attending imperial dinners felt like descending into the underworld. He described being forced to watch acts that he couldn't bring himself to describe in detail, even decades later. He wrote of respected colleagues who emerged from the palace looking broken, their dignity shattered by what they'd been compelled to witness and participate in. The emperor seemed to take particular pleasure in humiliating Rome's traditional elite. He would appoint former slaves to positions of authority over freeborn citizens. He gave military commands to his Syrian favorites who had never seen battle. He elevated prostitutes and actors to senatorial rank, while forcing genuine senators to perform menial tasks usually reserved for slaves. This wasn't random cruelty. This was systematic destruction of the social order that had made Rome great. Every appointment, every dinner party, every public appearance was designed to demonstrate that Roman traditions meant nothing, that Roman honor was worthless, that Roman civilization itself was just another plaything for his amusement. The financial cost of his lifestyle was staggering. The imperial treasury, built up over centuries of conquest and careful management, began hemorrhaging gold at unprecedented rates. Elagabalus spent money on luxuries that previous emperors would have considered absurd. His clothing budget alone exceeded the annual salaries of entire legions. But the most disturbing revelations were yet to come. The cost wasn't just financial. It was moral, social, and spiritual. Rome was watching its teenage emperor systematically dismantle everything that had made the empire great. And the worst was still to come. The cost wasn't just financial. It was moral, social, and spiritual. Rome was watching its teenage emperor systematically dismantle everything that had made the empire great, and the worst was still to come. The emperor's personal relationships became the stuff of legend, though not the kind any civilization wants to remember. Roman historians, who had chronicled the deeds of dozens of emperors, found themselves facing documentation challenges they'd never encountered before. How do you record behaviors that your language barely has words for? How do you describe acts that violate every principle your society holds sacred? Elagabalus surrounded himself with what he called his inner circle, though Roman writers used far less diplomatic terms. These weren't advisors or friends in any traditional sense. They were enablers who encouraged his worst impulses while enriching themselves from his largesse. The emperor showered them with titles, wealth, and privileges that should have belonged to Rome's most distinguished citizens. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. The emperor's behavior wasn't just eccentric or even immoral by Roman standards. It was actively destructive to the people around him. Those who entered his orbit often emerged damaged, broken, or dead. The palace became a place where careers went to die, where reputations were shattered, where the powerful learned what it meant to be powerless. Roman sources describe a pattern of behavior that modern psychologists might recognize, but ancient historians could only document with growing horror. The emperor seemed to derive pleasure not just from breaking rules, but from forcing others to watch him break them. He needed an audience for his transgressions, preferably an audience that was suffering because of what they were witnessing. Take the case of Camazon, a charioteer from Syria, who caught the emperor's attention during his first year in power. Within months, this former entertainer found himself elevated to the highest military command in the empire. He was given authority over legions that had conquered half the known world, despite never having held a sword in combat. The appointment wasn't just inappropriate, it was dangerous. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was how Elagabalus used Camazon's elevation to humiliate Rome's genuine military heroes. Decorated generals who had spent decades defending the empire were forced to take orders from a man whose previous experience involved driving horses around a track for crowd entertainment. The emperor seemed to feed off their humiliation, hosting ceremonies where real soldiers had to bow down to his Syrian favorite. The pattern repeated across every level of government. Traditional Roman administrators found themselves replaced by the emperor's personal favorites, regardlessance. The empire's bureau of qualification or competracy, refined over centuries to govern hundreds of millions of people, was handed over to individuals whose only credential was their willingness to participate in the emperor's increasingly bizarre lifestyle. But administrative chaos was nothing compared to what happened when Elagabalus decided to reform Roman religious practices. The black stone he'd brought from Syria wasn't just a symbol. It was the centerpiece of rituals that Roman witnesses described as unspeakably depraved. The emperor didn't just worship this foreign god. He forced the entire empire to participate in ceremonies that violated every Roman concept of sacred behavior. The details that survived in historical accounts are fragmentary, partly because Roman historians couldn't bring themselves to record everything they witnessed, and partly because later Christian writers destroyed many documents they considered too obscene to preserve. But what remains paints a picture of religious ceremonies that combined the worst elements of fanaticism, exhibitionism, and cruelty. Elagabalus appointed himself as high priest of his Syrian cult, but he didn't perform these duties in private. He conducted public rituals in the heart of Rome, forcing citizens to watch as their emperor engaged in behaviors that would have scandalized even the most debauched mystery religions. These weren't solemn religious observances. They were theatrical performances designed to shock and humiliate the Roman people. The emperor seemed particularly obsessed with forcing Rome's traditional priests to participate in his Syrian rituals. These men, who had spent their lives serving Jupiter, Mars, and the other gods of Rome, were compelled to take part in ceremonies that violated everything they believed sacred. Many chose exile rather than compliance. Others simply disappeared from the historical record, their fates unknown but easily imagined. The religious revolution wasn't just about personal preference or even cultural change. It was about power, specifically the power to force an entire civilization to abandon its most fundamental beliefs. Every time a Roman citizen was compelled to participate in Syrian rituals, they were being reminded that their traditions meant nothing, that their gods were powerless, that their emperor controlled not just their bodies, but their souls. The economic implications became catastrophic as the emperor's reign progressed. The Syrian cult required massive expenditures for temple construction, elaborate ceremonies, and the maintenance of foreign priests who demanded luxury accommodations. The black stone itself had to be housed in a temple that rivaled Jupiter's in size and exceeded it in opulence. But religious expenses were nothing compared to the emperor's personal spending habits. Roman sources describe a lifestyle so extravagant that it beggared the imagination of people who had grown up watching imperial excess. Previous emperors had been criticized for building too many palaces or hosting too many games. Elagabalus made their expenditures look modest by comparison. His clothing alone became a symbol of imperial madness. While Roman men wore simple togas that emphasized dignity and restraint, Elagabalus appeared in silk robes that cost more than most citizens earned in a lifetime. He wore makeup that transformed his face into something Roman observers struggled to recognize as masculine. He adorned himself with jewelry that belonged in temples rather than on human bodies. The emperor's appearance became a daily assault on Roman sensibilities. Citizens who glimpsed him during public appearances reported feeling physically ill. This wasn't just cultural shock. This was psychological warfare conducted through costume and cosmetics, a deliberate attempt to force Romans to question everything they believed about gender, power, and imperial dignity. But appearance was just the surface manifestation of deeper changes that were destroying the empire from within. The real damage was happening in the corridors of power, where traditional Roman governance was being replaced by something that resembled organized chaos, more than imperial administration. Every morning brought new appointments that defied logic and tradition. Every afternoon brought new policies that contradicted centuries of Roman law. Every evening brought new scandals that left the Senate struggling to maintain even the pretense of normal government function. The senators who survived this period later described a sense of living in a waking nightmare where nothing made sense, where competence was punished and degradation was rewarded, where the very concept of Roman virtue had been turned inside out by a teenage emperor who seemed determined to prove that nothing was sacred, nothing was permanent, and nothing was safe from his appetite for destruction. The breaking point came during the Icia festival of 220 CE, when Elagabalus committed an act so monstrous that even his Syrian supporters began questioning their loyalty. The festival traditionally honored the Egyptian goddess Isis with solemn processions and dignified ceremonies. But the emperor had other plans. He announced that his Syrian sun god would marry Isis in a ceremony that would unite East and West under divine blessing. What actually happened defied every concept of religious reverence known to the ancient world. Elagabalus dressed himself as the goddess, complete with elaborate headdress and feminine robes, then conducted a mock wedding ceremony where he played both bride and groom. The spectacle didn't end with religious parody. The emperor forced Rome's most distinguished citizens to participate as wedding guests, requiring senators to throw flower petals while he performed what Roman historians could only describe as unspeakable acts with religious statues. The ceremony lasted 3 days, during which the emperor declared that he was now pregnant with divine children who would rule the world. But even this blasphemous theater was overshadowed by what happened to the wedding gifts. Citizens had been commanded to bring offerings worthy of divine marriage. Gold, silver, precious gems, and priceless artworks poured into the temple. Instead of dedicating these treasures to religious purposes, Elagabalus used them to fund an orgy that lasted a full week. The sacred gifts became props in entertainments that would have been illegal in Rome's most notorious brothels. The psychological impact on Roman society was devastating. People who had witnessed the ceremony reported nightmares that lasted for months. Some citizens fled the city entirely, preferring exile to living under an emperor who treated their gods like toys in his personal theater. Others simply shut themselves in their homes, refusing to emerge until the madness ended. The emperor's appetite for degrading Roman traditions seemed limitless. He established what he called the New Senate, composed entirely of his Syrian favorites, male prostitutes, and former slaves. This body met weekly to make decisions about imperial policy, though their qualifications consisted entirely of their willingness to participate in the emperor's increasingly elaborate debaucheries. Real senators found themselves reduced to spectators in their own government. They were required to attend new Senate meetings, but only as observers. They watched helplessly as their empire was governed by men whose previous experience involved selling their bodies in Syrian marketplaces. Laws were passed based on the whims of people who couldn't read the documents they were approving. The military implications became catastrophic when Elagabalus decided to reform the Roman legions. He appointed his Syrian lovers as generals, regardless of their complete lack of military experience. Seasoned centurions who had spent decades defending the empire found themselves taking orders from teenagers who had never seen battle except in the emperor's bedroom performances. One Syrian favorite named Hierocles was elevated to command the 3rd Legion, stationed on the dangerous Germanic frontier. The appointment was made during one of the emperor's dinner parties, where military commands were distributed like party favors to whoever had pleased the emperor most recently. Within weeks, the 3rd Legion was in open revolt, refusing to follow orders from a commander who had earned his position through sexual services rather than military merit. The economic consequences were beyond catastrophic. The imperial treasury, which had survived the expensive reigns of multiple extravagant emperors, was hemorrhaging gold at rates that defied mathematical calculation. Elagabalus spent more money in a single month than previous emperors had spent in entire years. His personal expenses exceeded the military budget of the entire empire. The emperor's bathhouse alone cost more than constructing the Colosseum. He imported water from sacred springs across the empire, mixed with rare oils and perfumes that cost their weight in gold. The bathhouse was staffed by hundreds of attendants whose salaries exceeded those of provincial governors. Citizens reported that the emperor sometimes bathed 5 times daily, each session requiring complete replacement of the expensive water mixture. But the bathhouse was modest compared to his clothing expenses. Roman emperors traditionally owned perhaps a dozen togas of varying quality for different occasions. Elagabalus possessed over 3,000 silk robes, each one more elaborate than the last. His jewelry collection included crowns that had belonged to foreign queens, necklaces that contained more gems than most temples, and rings worth more than entire cities. The emperor's diet became legendary for its absurdity and expense. While Romans prided themselves on simple foods that emphasized substance over luxury, Elagabalus demanded delicacies that required importing ingredients from the edges of the known world. He ate only off golden plates that were melted down and recast after each meal. His wine came from vineyards so exclusive that their entire annual production was reserved for imperial consumption. One dinner party reportedly cost more than feeding a legion for an entire year. The emperor served peacock tongues, flamingo brains, and other delicacies so rare that obtaining them required expeditions to distant provinces. Guests were required to eat these exotic foods while naked, participating in conversations that Roman writers described as too obscene to record. The waste was systematic and deliberate. Elagabalus seemed to derive pleasure not just from luxury, but from the knowledge that his excesses were bankrupting the empire. He would order expensive items specifically to destroy them in front of audiences, forcing citizens to watch as their tax money literally went up in smoke. The emperor's personal staff numbered in the thousands, each one paid more than skilled craftsmen earned in a year. He employed separate servants for each article of clothing, different attendants for different times of day, and specialized workers whose only job was maintaining his collection of cosmetics. The palace required its own economy just to function. Meanwhile, the provinces were being taxed into rebellion to fund these imperial extravagances. Egypt, which had been Rome's wealthiest territory, began showing signs of economic collapse as its grain tribute was sold to buy Syrian silk. Gaul's silver mines worked overtime to finance the emperor's jewelry collection. Spain's olive oil production was diverted to fill the imperial bathhouses. The social fabric of Roman society was disintegrating under the pressure of supporting an emperor whose appetites knew no bounds. Traditional Roman families found themselves choosing between financial ruin and moral compromise as imperial tax collectors demanded payments that could only be raised through desperate measures. But the financial crisis was nothing compared to what Elagabalus was planning for Roman marriage customs. Having exhausted the possibilities of shocking the empire through his own marriages, the emperor decided to reform the institution itself. He announced that all Roman marriages would henceforth be conducted according to Syrian customs, which involved rituals that Romans considered indistinguishable from prostitution. The new marriage laws required couples to participate in public ceremonies that violated every Roman concept of dignity and privacy. Wedding nights became community events, where citizens were forced to witness consummations that had previously been sacred private moments. The emperor claimed these reforms would create stronger families by eliminating Roman prudishness. But the real purpose was obvious to anyone who understood his psychology. He needed new ways to humiliate Roman citizens, new methods of forcing them to abandon their traditional values, new opportunities to demonstrate that their most sacred institutions were subject to his whims. Every wedding that followed his new customs was another victory in his war against Roman civilization. The reaction was swift and violent. Families began fleeing to remote provinces to avoid the new marriage requirements. Others simply stopped getting married entirely, preferring to live in informal arrangements rather than subject themselves to imperial-mandated degradation. The birth rate in Rome itself plummeted as citizens chose childlessness over raising children in a world where their most intimate moments were subject to imperial oversight. But Elagabalus wasn't finished. His next target was Roman education, which he decided needed reform to match his vision of imperial culture. Traditional Roman schools emphasized rhetoric, philosophy, and civic virtue. The emperor established new schools that taught Syrian customs, sexual techniques, and what he called divine worship, but what parents recognized as organized corruption of their children. Children as young as 7 were required to attend these imperial schools, where they learned to worship the Syrian sun god and participate in ceremonies that their parents couldn't bear to imagine. The curriculum included subjects that no Roman child had ever been taught, practices that violated every concept of childhood innocence that Roman society had developed over centuries. Parents who refused to send their children to imperial schools faced imprisonment or exile. Those who complied watched helplessly as their sons and daughters returned home speaking Syrian phrases, practicing foreign customs, and asking questions that revealed exposure to knowledge no child should possess. The emperor seemed particularly focused on destroying the next generation of Romans. He understood that his reign would eventually end, but if he could corrupt an entire generation of children, his influence would persist long after his death. Every child who graduated from his schools would carry Syrian customs into adulthood, spreading the cultural poison he had introduced throughout the empire. The long-term implications were terrifying to Roman parents who understood what was happening. They were watching their civilization die, not through military conquest or natural disaster, but through systematic corruption of everything they held sacred. Their emperor was using their own children as weapons against their culture, turning the next generation into instruments of their parents' destruction. This wasn't random madness or even systematic cruelty. This was cultural genocide conducted with surgical precision by an emperor who understood exactly what he was destroying and why. Every reform, every ceremony, every appointment was designed to eliminate Roman identity and replace it with something that served his personal appetites rather than imperial greatness. The empire was hemorrhaging not just gold, but soul. Citizens who had once felt pride in Roman achievement now felt shame at Roman degradation. The eagles that had carried Roman power to the edges of the world now represented a civilization that had lost its way so completely that its own emperor had become its greatest enemy. But the worst revelations were still coming. What Elagabalus had done to Roman institutions was merely preparation for what he planned to do to Roman bodies, Roman minds, and Roman souls. The breaking point arrived when Elagabalus announced his most deranged policy yet. Roman citizenship, the prize that millions across the empire had died trying to achieve, would now be granted based on a single criterion: not military service, not years of loyal tribute, not demonstrated virtue or civic contribution. Citizens would be selected based on their willingness to participate in what the emperor called sacred union with divinity. The details of these selection ceremonies were so horrific that most contemporary accounts were deliberately destroyed by later emperors who feared that even reading about them might corrupt Roman minds. What survived suggests rituals that combined religious fanaticism with sexual depravity in ways that defied human imagination. Candidates for citizenship were required to prove their devotion to the Syrian sun god through acts that Roman witnesses described as unspeakable violations of natural law. The emperor presided over these ceremonies personally, dressed in robes that sparkled with gems worth more than entire provinces. He claimed to be channeling divine power through his body, transforming ordinary humans into blessed citizens of his reformed empire. But witnesses reported something very different. They saw a teenage tyrant using religious authority to force desperate people into situations that destroyed their humanity while satisfying his own twisted appetites. The psychological impact on participants was devastating. Many emerged from these citizenship ceremonies in states that Roman physicians couldn't treat. They had been broken in ways that went beyond physical damage, reduced to shells of their former selves by experiences their minds couldn't process. Some never spoke again. Others spoke constantly, but only in Syrian phrases that made no sense to Roman listeners. The emperor seemed to feed off this destruction of human dignity. He would display his newest citizens at court ceremonies, forcing senators and foreign ambassadors to witness what Roman citizenship had become under his rule. These broken individuals, adorned with imperial honors they had earned through degradation, served as living warnings about the price of opposing imperial will. But even these horrors paled compared to what Elagabalus planned for Roman children. He announced the creation of imperial youth brigades, organizations that would prepare the next generation for citizenship in his reformed empire. Boys and girls as young as 6 were enrolled in programs that their parents were forbidden to discuss or even acknowledge. The training facilities were established throughout the empire, but always in locations where parents couldn't observe what was happening to their children. These weren't schools in any traditional sense. They were indoctrination centers designed to reshape young minds according to the emperor's vision of human nature. Children entered these facilities as Romans and emerged as something else entirely. The curriculum included subjects that violated every Roman concept of childhood education. Children learned to worship the Syrian sun god through rituals that adult priests found disturbing. They practiced ceremonies that prepared them for the citizenship selection process they would face upon reaching adolescence. They were taught that Roman traditions were lies, that their parents' values were primitive superstitions, that only the emperor's truth mattered. Parents who tried to visit these facilities were turned away by Syrian guards who spoke no Latin. Those who persisted in demanding access to their children simply disappeared. Imperial records from this period show massive increases in missing person reports, almost all involving parents who had asked too many questions about the Youth Brigade program. The emperor took personal interest in monitoring the progress of his young recruits. He would visit training facilities unannounced, selecting particularly promising students for private instruction in the imperial palace. These children, some barely old enough to read, would spend weeks or months in the emperor's personal chambers, receiving education that their instructors called advanced preparation for divine service. None of these specially selected children ever returned to normal training. They joined the emperor's permanent household staff, serving roles that Roman observers found impossible to describe without violating decency standards. The emperor claimed they had been elevated to sacred positions that would prepare them for leadership in his reformed empire. The reality was visible to anyone with eyes to see. The madness ended on March 11th, 222 CE, when the Praetorian Guard finally struck. They found Elagabalus cowering in a latrine, still wearing his silk robes and painted face. His death was swift, but the damage he had inflicted on Roman civilization would echo for generations. In just 4 years, this teenage emperor had proven that absolute power in the wrong hands could unravel centuries of achievement. His reign stands as history's ultimate warning about what happens when moral boundaries disappear and human appetite becomes the only law that matters. Elagabalus didn't just corrupt an empire. He demonstrated how quickly the pillars of civilization can crumble when those sworn to protect them become their greatest destroyers instead.